official, I just tested out the nuke build in Diablo 4, and this variant of the Hammers of the Ancients build is unstoppable. It's so good you can delete a boss just like Thanos, just like that.
I'm sorry, little one.
Between all of the different barbarian builds, this one may actually just be the most fun. You get to Hulk smash everything in sight, and it's generally very fun to play. So much so I would even recommend that you might look at respeccing just to try it because it's that much fun. This build may not just win the award for most fun barbarian build, but it's just as powerful to compete with the rest of the builds, because once you level up you can do millions and millions of damage in a single swing. Because it just goes to show, even at level 60 and below, you can nuke these enemies out of existence. It is so good. You can delete almost everybody with Hammer of the Ancients. That's why I'm going to go through step by step everything that I'm using, from skills to gear to aspects, to let you just start one-tapping people into the quantum realm. It's insane. So first let's go over the skills. Like a lot of other builds that I've shown, we're going to go with Lunging Strike. It's going to give us that maximum extra life and bleed damage that it's going to inflict upon enemies, which is important because you're going to be able to lunge after enemies very quickly. It's a very good skill early game, and we want to add bleed damage onto enemies. Next is our core skill. We're going to go with Hammer of the Ancients. We're going to go 5 out of 5 here because this is our bread and butter skill. This is going to be the skill that lets us nuke enemies out of existence. So you can see it does a large amount of damage here just on the regular swing. It does cost a lot of fury, but we're going to manage that later on in the build. Next, we're going to go into Enhanced Hammer of the Ancients, which means we're going to get 3% more fury for 5 seconds for each enemy damaged, meaning we can get up to a 30% stack every 5 seconds for hitting enough enemies, at least 5 with this. If you hit at least 5 enemies, your fury regeneration is going to be very excellent. And then Furious Hammer of the Ancients, this is where you deal 1% additional damage for each point of fury you had when using it. The whole idea here is we want to regenerate our fury as quick as possible, so that way if we have 100 fury, and that's what we use before casting the skill, that means we deal 100% additional damage, doubling our damage with the skill, which is why you can literally drop the hammer on people. Next, we're going to jump down to our shouts, and just like a lot of other builds, we're going to be using Rallying Cry 5 out of 5. We're going to be using Enhanced Rallying Cry and Tactical Rallying Cry. We're using Rallying Cry because we get that 30% movement speed buff and 56% resource generation, which is going to allow us to maintain our fury throughout using all our abilities. Enhanced Rallying Cry, that grants you Unstoppable while active, which is a debuff effect. And then Tactical Rallying Cry, which means when you cast Rallying Cry, you automatically generate 20 fury, and it grants you an additional 20% resource generation. So we're going to be generating even more fury. That way we never run out. We're then going to go into Challenging Shout 1 out of 5. And then we're going to go Enhanced Challenging Shout and Tactical Challenging Shout. Now this is going to taunt nearby enemies and gain 40% damage reduction. So this is a defensive skill we're going to be primarily using for defense. When you're in a big group of enemies or you need some survivability for a minute, you're going to cast Challenging Shout. It's going to give you that big damage reduction buff. And then with the modifiers, you also gain 20% bonus extra life, and you gain 3% fury each time you take damage. So if we cast this when we're fighting a big group of enemies, not only are we going to get the damage reduction and bonus life buffs, but we're also going to be getting the fury regeneration buffs, because each time we take damage again, we get 3 fury each time. We're then going to go down here to Brawling Skills and pick up Warcry. We're going to put 5 out of 5 here, and then we're going to go into Enhanced Warcry and Mighty Warcry. Now Warcry with the buffs makes it so that we get a solid damage dealt percentage bonus. Additionally, the modifiers grant you Berserking for 4 seconds. Berserking is very important in this build because it gets us 25% increased damage and 15% increased movement speed. And then the final modifier grants you 15% additional base life as Fortify. And while you're fortified, you take 10% less damage. And we're going to try and stay fortified because there's some additional benefits on the build we get if we're fortified almost at all times. Now the important passives here, we're going to go 3 out of 3 for Booming Voice. This increases your shout durations by 24%, meaning our shouts stay up much longer, considering we have 3 of them already. Raid Leader, which means your shouts also heal allies for 3% of their maximum health per second, which is great when running with a party. And this Yell passive, which I'm not even going to attempt to say it, your shout skills could cause enemies to deal 12% less damage for 5 seconds, which is a nice damage reduction buff. We're then going to grab Aggressive Resistance, meaning we gain 3% damage reduction while berserking. And we're already going to be berserking when we cast Warcry, so that's just extra damage reduction. And then we're going to go into Prolific Fury, meaning again, while we're berserking, which we will be most of the time, fury generation is increased by 18%. That hopefully at some point we should be able to cast our skills almost infinitely. Then once we go down to weapon mastery, we're just going to grab some passives here, being Pit Fighter 3 out of 3. This means you gain 9% increased damage to close enemies and gain 6% distant damage reduction. No Mercy, where you have 9% increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies, which will proc almost every single time because we're going to put one single point in hamstring where your bleeding effects slow enemies by 10%, and will almost always have bleeding effects on all enemies, so they'll always be slowed, and that means they'll always have that increased critical strike chance, which is very, very important. And then we're going to grab 1 point in Thick Skin, which means each time you take direct damage, you gain 0.4% base life as Fortify, which means at every point we will almost always be fortified because of this, because we're always going to be taking damage. And counteroffensive, meaning while you have Fortify for over 50% of your maximum life, you deal 4% increased damage. And eventually you're going to want to put 3 out of 3 points here, so that way you get a total damage bonus of 12%. Then we're going to grab our ultimate skills. So earlier in the game, you're going to want to grab Call of the Ancients while leveling up, because it's going to be the biggest benefit to you as a skill. And also while leveling up, you're going to want to replace Challenging Shout with Leap, because Leap is going to give you a good movement ability, as well as an Enhanced Leap, and then Power Leap, which can generate additional 40 Fury if you damage at least one enemy. So Leap is a great skill for a beginner game, and Call of the Ancients is good early on to replace Wrath of the Berserker. Now, the skill we want primarily as ultimate skill is Wrath of the Berserker, and that is because it gives us a ton of great buffs. When you cast this along with your other shouts, this means you gain Berserking and Unstoppable, and again, Berserking gives us that additional damage buff. And for the next 10 seconds, when you deal direct damage with basic skills, it grants you Berserking for 5 more seconds. So you can essentially take the Berserking for 5 seconds, hit an enemy, grab Berserking again, and then right before it runs out, hit another enemy with a basic skill and grab Berserking for a 3rd time. And then once we go to Prime Wrath of the Berserker, we're going to be getting an additional movement speed buff and increased Fury generation by 30%. And then Supreme, while Wrath of the Berserker is active, every 50 Fury you spend, which we can spend it very, very quickly, increases Berserk's damage bonus by 25%. So as long as we're applying Berserking to ourselves, every single time we cast our skill, we're going to do additional bonus damage by 25%. And you can end up getting around 200 to 250 fairly easily bonus from this, because it just stacks on top of each other over and over and over again. Our passives, we're going to want to grab Tempered Fury, because this increases our maximum Fury by 3, and then we're going to end up wanting to put 3 points in Invigorating Fury, which means you heal for 3% of your maximum life for each 100 Fury spent, and we spend Fury very, very quickly, so this is basically a self-healing ability where you'll be able to get back a bunch of your health. And then finally, early game, you're going to want to use Gushing Wounds or one of these other passives just for the meantime. But as you start to level up, the main one you want is Unbridled Rage, because this core skill gives us 135% increased damage but costs 100% more Fury. This gives us a huge damage buff all the time. It does cost us more Fury to cast our skill this way, but once you have Fury regeneration to a point, you don't have to worry about your Fury. This is the best because it gives you so much more damage. Now again, if this is early game and you're having trouble currently regenerating and maintaining your Fury regeneration, you don't want this because you're going to run out of Fury over and over and over again. But once you get that Fury regeneration down, which I'll talk about here in a minute, especially with all of the other skills, this is what you want to run. Now the expertise for this barbarian, you're going to want to make sure you're using a two-handed mace. So if you look at my weapon here, I'm using a two-handed mace, and this is so that way we get the expertise bonus right here. This would apply as long as we're using that on our skill Hammer of the Ancients, and it makes you use your two-handed bludgeoning weapon. So as long as you have a mace equipped for your two-handed bludgeoning weapon, you're good. That means we're going to get this bonus where we get a lucky hit up to 10% chance to gain 2 Fury when hitting an enemy. So we can get a lot of Fury just by random chance with how many enemies we fight, and you get 15% increased critical strike damage to stunned and vulnerable enemies while berserking, and we're going to be berserking most of the time, which I'll go over here in just a little bit. And you get 15% increased critical strike damage to stun and vulnerable enemies while berserking, and we're going to be berserking most of the time with this build. Now for your technique slot, you're going to want to make sure you use the two-handed sword expertise, so we get the additional bonus of 20% of direct damage you deal is inflicted as bleeding damage over 5 seconds. So even if we don't finish an enemy off in one hit, which we will most 99% of the time, but if we don't, they'll be finished off by the bleeding damage, so that's good. And you want to make sure for your lunging strike that you have the two-handed sword selected here. So you can see I got a two-handed sword selected, and you're going to want to make sure that you just select that for lunging strike, so that's the weapon you're using, and we can take advantage of that bleed damage and those benefits. Now let's go over all of the aspects that make this build so great and hit so hard. So the first aspect is going to be offensive aspect of Ancestral Force. What this is going to do is when imprinted on an item, it makes Hammer of the Ancients quake outwards, and it deals an additional set of damage to enemies anywhere from 64% to 100% when on a two-handed weapon. Now this damage is normally 32 to 50% as you can see, but when you put it on a two-handed weapon, that power doubles, so it deals an additional, like I mentioned, 64 to 100% damage. Even if you use the Codex of Power to imprint this on a weapon, you still deal 64% extra damage, getting you close to doubling your damage. So this is the #1 imprint you should absolutely have right off the bat. Whether you're lower or higher level, you should always put this on a two-handed weapon that you have because of the insane power upgrade you get from it, and this can be easily obtained in the Codex of Power by going up here to the Sunken Ruins dungeon, and you can just complete this and it will be added to your Codex of Power. Next is going to be Edge Master's offensive aspect. This makes it so that skills deal up to 10 to 20% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast. So essentially that's going to base off our Fury. So if our Fury is at 100%, we're going to get the max benefit damage from the skill, and we should have enough Fury regeneration at this point that we should almost always have max Fury, even when spamming our Hammer of the Ancients ability, giving us this overall additional percentage damage boost pretty much most of the time. The next aspect is going to be the Bold Chieftain's resource aspect. This aspect is wanted in every barbarian build possible. This makes it so that whenever you cast a shout skill, its cooldown is reduced by 1 to 1.9 seconds per enemy nearby, up to a maximum of 6 seconds. And you can see if we're running 3 or 4 shouts on this build, by doing that we can have almost infinite uptime on our shouts. This is a very hard aspect to find, but if you can find it on a ring, no matter what you need to put this on your build, it will make your build go from amazing to godly. The next aspect you want on your build is resource aspect of Echoing Fury. You can see I have it on my ring here. It makes it so that your shout skills generate 2 to 4 Fury per second while active, and most of the time we have 3 or 4 shout skills activated at once, meaning we're adding a lot of Fury to our Fury regeneration overall. And since we use our shouts consecutively all the time, this is going to create a lot of Fury, and it's going to keep us from running out of Fury so we can spam our Hammer of the Ancients ability very, very often. And finally, this is an aspect that I use a lot, and it's on my helmet. What it does is when damaging an elite enemy, it grants you a barrier absorbing up to a certain amount of damage for 10 seconds, and this effect can only happen once every 30 seconds. You get a huge barrier equivalent to like sometimes double your health by having it here on your helmet. If you can find something like this with a really good roll and apply it to your helmet, it almost makes sure that your survivability goes through the roof because enemies can't really break through this barrier, especially with all your other buffs active. So this basically keeps you alive almost all of the time. Now for stats, there's certain things we want to pay attention to. So primarily things like damage to bleeding enemies, damage to stunned enemies, damage to injured, and damage to close enemies. These are big bonuses, as you can see, big percentages that really actually help to increase your damage quite a lot, as well as the huge boost to critical strike damage. We're going to want a lot of critical strike damage, and we're also going to want a bunch of vulnerable enemy damage. This is a big boost for this build because vulnerable enemy damage is huge. You can see we're going to be using gems or emeralds on all our weapons. They give us critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, and now I'm going to break this down to kind of show you how it works. Now I'm going to show you the Paragon Board to show you kind of how to set it up. And what setup you're going to be doing a ton of extra damage. It makes a huge difference. You're just going to want to take these initial paths and copy kind of what you see here. The first glyph socket, you're going to want to make sure you put the exploit glyph here. This is because it gives you vulnerable damage to enemies once leveled up, and initially once you just hit the minimum requirements of the dexterity requirement. This makes it so that when an enemy is damaged by you or you just hit an enemy, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds, and once they're vulnerable for 3 seconds, they take 20% increased vulnerable damage. We get the vulnerable damage to them from this glyph itself, and we get all the vulnerable damage from all of our weapons and all of our armor, etc. That's why we want to stack vulnerable damage on all our weapons as much as possible, because every single time we hit an enemy, once this glyph is activated, we're going to proc that vulnerable buff and be able to do massive damage to them. As soon as you meet the requirements for this, you're going to see your damage go way up immediately. And if you're not familiar with these glyphs, the way they work is you can see the red area around the glyph. Now this red area expands out as you level up the actual glyph from the Nightmare dungeons, but essentially it has a requirement at the bottom, plus 27 out of plus 25. That just means you need to get plus 25 dexterity from the nodes within this red area, meaning here, and here, which is why we actually meet the requirements and get this bonus. Now, if you go to this next board, the second board is going to be the Blood Rage board, so turn it just so it looks like this. The main thing we're going to focus on here, barring all of the other nodes, is the glyph socket, which is this glyph socket, which we're going to put the martial glyph in. This is important because it gives us damage reduction, it gives us damage to bleeding enemies, but overall, once you meet the requirements for this glyph, at the bottom, it makes it so that after casting a shout, the active cooldown of every other shout skill is reduced by 1.2 seconds. which is huge because it plays into our shout reduction and cooldown reduction to make it to where we can cast our shouts much more frequently over time, and hopefully get it closer to a point where we can cast them almost infinitely every single time they go down, so we'll never run out of fury this way. Next, you're going to want to go to the Decimator board, and we're going to use and slot the Disembowel glyph in the socket. This gives us physical damage over time, and it makes it so that killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate active cooldowns by 1 second. And what that means is our shouts essentially. So our shouts are going to benefit from this because we're going to go through so many enemies. That 10% chance is going to turn into a much higher percent chance because we're getting rid of so many enemies, right? And this is going to make it so that our cooldowns, again, we get huge cooldown reduction from this glyph. Then we're going to go up to our fourth board, which is our Warbringer board, and we're going to socket the Wrath glyph here. And this is going to give us critical strike damage with our core skills, which is big amounts of damage considering our primary skill is a core skill, Hammer of the Ancients, and skills that critically strike generate 3 fury additionally. So this is a great glyph to have as well. This is kind of how you want to set it up. So essentially, once you do this and kind of follow, and I'll zoom out a little bit to go through this one more time, but this is how you want to set your board up, and make sure you have these glyphs on these particular boards so you can get the full requirements and benefit from them, because you're going to see yourself doing a lot more damage once you start getting these glyphs, and I mean a lot more damage. So essentially the way the rotation on this build works is you have your Rallying Cry Shout, which gives you your huge resource generation buff. So you're going to pop that first every single time you get into a fight. You're then going to pop War Cry, which gives you a 21% damage dealt bonus, as well as grants you Fortify, which gives us additional bonuses because if we're fortified, some of the passives make it so we do extra damage and things like that. Challenging Shout is going to give us damage reduction, so you can also pop this if you want, especially going into a big group of enemies or a boss fight. And then your fourth shout, which is Wrath of the Berserker. And this is a big one because it gives you, remember, the berserking bonuses. And then when you have enough fury, you're just going to spam Hammer of the Ancients. At that point, you're buffed up from all these buffs, especially a lot of gear that has cooldown reduction. Once you get all of that stuff in place, you should eventually see a little bit later on in levels that you have almost infinite generation on your shouts, so that way you'll never have to wait on them to actually have a cooldown. And you can see by buffing with our shouts and doing huge hits with Hammer of the Ancients to enemies, you can knock people out like instantly. I mean, you can one-shot most enemies in this game with Hammer of the Ancients, straight up. If you've been playing another Barbarian build, you might want to consider at least giving this a try, because it's very good and it's super powerful. I mean, sometimes I'm hitting 20k, 40k crits, and sometimes I'm able to just wipe out elites in one hit, and I wonder kind of where they went, because I think they teleported away. But no, it just takes one hit is all. So this build is extremely powerful, and you can see here that, I mean, even just regular, it wipes out regular bosses like non-stop. Obviously don't have my character min-maxed all the way yet because I'm only level 61, but this build is actually a very good and solid Barbarian build that does a lot of damage. That being said, this is one of the funner builds that I've played, and this Barbarian build does not kid. You can go through bosses, I mean run through bosses and elites with this build, as you've just seen, like instantly and non-stop. You can 1 or 2 hit basically every single enemy and elite in this game minus major bosses. And honestly, the biggest thing, this build is super fun to play. So highly recommend you guys try it. Make sure you guys like the video if you like this build. Subscribe if you're new, and check out one of these Diablo videos on the left or the right. Thank you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.